Captive Bodies, the Sexual Politics of Policing Blackness. So this panel is going to take us into the antagonisms of transformation and containment through the various institutions that manage and message race, religion, gender, and sexualities. Is it all right if I pluralize that term and talk about sexualities? Together, our panelists will ask and investigate not only how black bodies are policed and I might add produced by a variety of disciplinary regimes, but also how we might think anew about the possibilities of imagining new futures for and through those bodies that resist the police power. And we have an incredible lineup of people here. I've heard almost all of them in other venues or read their work, so you're in for a real treat. Our panelists' bios are listed in the program. I won't refer to them. I simply direct your attention to them. And we're going to hear from our panelists in the order in which they're seated next to me. So our first panelist will be Robert Fullilove.
Well, good morning. This is the first time in a while I've been giving an address before an audience where I don't know anybody. And the irony, of course, is that in many respects, many of the issues that bring us here today are things that I've been dealing with over the course of what I would like to consider to be a reasonably long life. 50 years ago, I was in Holly Springs, Mississippi, field secretary for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, working to engage churches in that community in the struggle for civil rights. I was so impressed with the struggles I had to get some pastors involved in the struggle that I started Union Theological Seminary in 1967. I got ordained under very odd circumstances in 1970. But since 1986, I've been a public health professional engaged in research into the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And because I'm the first one to speak, and because what I want to say has to be understood in the context of mass incarceration in the United States, let me just give you a few figures that'll sort of orient you to the ways in which, since the civil rights movement, this has been the most dominant issue in black communities nationwide. We are 5% of the world's population here in the United States, but we incarcerate 25% of all the world's prisoners. That process, which has been underway since the 1970s, basically began in its modern form with the war on drugs. 1970, Richard Nixon declares war on drugs by saying that drugs and drug abuse represents public enemy number one. 1973, the Drug Enforcement Administration is put together, and all of a sudden, from the standpoint of those of us in public health, we took a medical public health issue, issues that are related to addiction, to recovery, to the use of drugs, issues that we define psychiatrically in the DSM-4 as dependence disorders. We took an issue that is basically in the field of medicine and public health and decided to make it a criminal justice issue. So instead of opening up centers for treatment, we start to lock people up. And why am I so interested in this as an HIV/AIDS researcher? Well, very simply this. In 1981, we've started to see our first cases of HIV/AIDS. Gay men show up in clinics in Los Angeles with complaints and presenting with the characteristics of an old man's cancer, Kaposi sarcoma, and a very odd pneumonia, pneumocystis pneumonia, which is basically a characteristic of an immune system on decline. Old men's disorders present in the bodies of the young. And we quickly understand that we're in for a series of tragedies that persist to this day. 32 years into this epidemic, we're still struggling to understand how HIV has become such a dominant feature, not just in the US, but most certainly in the black community. And everybody's trying to figure out, where did this come from and how did it start? Please recall that in 1981, we saw folk at the end stage of HIV disease. You all are, I think, aware enough of how AIDS operates to understand that HIV presents itself as an infection that is asymptomatic. It can be in the body without showing any symptoms whatsoever for 10 to 12 years, which means that, for all intents and purposes, the real beginning of the HIV epidemic is in the 1960s and 1970s, when large numbers of intravenous drug users started to make their presence known in many of the communities that we are from. Those of you who are old enough to recall Man-Child in the Promised Land, can I get an amen? I was sort of very clear about how our communities were really transformed when the dope man showed up, the jobs disappeared, and the underground economy became a dominant feature of our life. Well, it's at that point that a lot of folks started sharing needles, and it's probably fair to say that at least in urban centers like New York City, the real beginning of the epidemic is not so much with gay men, as much as it is with intravenous drug users sharing needles and then being locked up. This is a way of saying that we made war on the group that was at greatest risk for an HIV infection. And we didn't even recognize that that was present in the city of New York when large numbers of intravenous drug users showed up with Kaposi's sarcoma and a number of pneumonias that we thought were simply the result of the hard life that addicts live in the street. Well, I want to suggest that from 1972, when there were 200,000 men in state and federal prisons in the United States, to 2012, when that number had grown to 2.2 million, with another 5.7 million doing time as on parole, on probation, or under the supervision of the courts. The fact that this phenomena has involved our community so greatly cannot be ignored. 41% of all the folk currently doing time in state and federal prison are African American. Another 18% are folk of Hispanic descent. Our politics of mass incarceration basically involves us. It's our communities. Not only that, because of the circulation between the prison and the community, it's fair to say that one of the major driving factors of the HIV epidemic in our communities has everything to do with the circulation of men and women from the community into the prison and then back again. Recall that recidivism rates are a feature of our politics of mass incarceration. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, roughly 70% of all the folk who are let out of prison, and there are 600,000 of them each year, will go back to prison within 3 to 4 years. So that 2.2 million figure that I cited is a moving target. Those aren't first-time offenders. Those are folk, many of whom have already been in the system and are simply coming back again because they violated the conditions of their parole. Well, if I'm right that one of the major driving factors is the ways in which this circulation occurred, for all intents and purposes, untreated, and if I'm also right that prisons became a place where folks used drugs, and in many cases engaged in same-sex sexual relationships, it's fair to say that much of what we've tried to do to contain the HIV epidemic in our communities has had to include, what do we do about the folk who are locked up? What do you do about the folk who are inside? Understand what that has done to many of our communities. It has dramatically affected the ways in which mating rituals occur. In some communities where 50% or more of the men are in prison doing time upstate somewhere, the folk who are left behind have had to struggle to readjust life so that family life can go on. Sandy Lane at the State University of New York in Syracuse has estimated that when a community loses more than 50% of its men, it is likely that changes in the way sexual relationships are negotiated will be observed, especially in our community, where we put, amongst heterosexuals, such a high premium on being in a relationship with somebody else, on having a man. So, at a time when we're trying to tell folk, be careful about your sexual relationships, make sure that you use condoms, make sure that you cover up, it becomes clear that for a lot of women, the desire to have a man and the cultural baggage that they carry means that they're perfectly okay about negotiating sexual relationships where condoms are not used. Let's also be clear that with so many men gone, ways in which partnerships are negotiated in our community have changed, especially in the poorest communities where incarceration hits hardest. Folks are engaged in what we describe as concurrent partnerships, where it's not so much how many partners you have, it's what they're chiming. Your man goes away, he's going to be gone doing a bid for 5 years. You're with somebody until he gets back. He may be engaged in something while he's away, and then when you get back, both of you will be engaged in a relationship that will be haunted by the relationships you were in while you were apart. It's also fair, I think, to point out that at a time when homophobia drives the HIV epidemic in our community more than anything else, the notion that while you're away, the expression that I've heard in some church circles is gay while away, has meant that churches have often fueled homophobia by worrying about what happens to a man when he's away. How long were you gone, bro? What'd you do while you were away? Did you do anything that we should know about? Oh, you infected with HIV? Oh my goodness, what is that all about? I want to suggest that part of what has driven this is the fact that on the one hand, many pastors are doing lion's work to be in prisons and helping to deal with the folk who are on the inside, incarcerated bodies, struggling to deal with their confinement, and often finding the most important comfort is in religion. But when they come back and their sexuality is in question, many of the things that have kept us as a community from having all important conversations about HIV have been mediated by the church and its inability to sort of understand alternate ways of understanding sexual behavior. There's no question but that with 50% of the new cases of HIV in the United States every year being in our community, our inability to have this discussion is driving the epidemic. If this epidemic has been driven by mass incarceration, it has also been the force that has limited our capacity to talk about it, and in talking about it, controlling it. And for my purposes, one of the most important issues that deals with the fact that so many of our men and increasing numbers of our women are away means that the foundations of important public health programs simply can't be put together because many of the men that we need with us are someplace else. I've been teaching in Woodbourne State Correctional Facility as part of the Barnard Prison Initiative for the last 3.5 years. It is amazing to give college courses to students who are really at a college level on the inside to understand the loss that our community has suffered. These are some of my best students, and I teach 5 courses down here at the Columbia campus and the medical science campus. So when I talk about making a comparison to what I see on the inside with what I have here, it becomes dramatically evident that after 25 years of teaching in this institution, some of my best students aren't here, they are away. That creativity has to be tapped. That so many of these brothers have found not just education, but religion on the inside, means that when they come back, we have to figure out a way to engage them in the community and put them, I think it's fair to say it in this way, in the service of the struggle. For me, that struggle has been going on for 50 years. It's interesting to see that what I saw in Mississippi is what I'm seeing right now in Black America. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Well, will they stay the same? Will this discourse that we've entered in over the course of this conference, over the course of the last 2 days, change the way we approach many issues of religion, sexuality in our community, and will it encompass what's happening to the brothers on the inside? Let me suggest that it is an idea, a debate, and a conversation whose time has come. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Reina Gossett.
Can folks hear me okay? These on? Yeah.
Just
Okay.
pull it a little closer.
A little closer. So thank you for what you were saying. I think it's really important to put people who are currently navigating criminalization, and especially people who are currently incarcerated in detention centers, prisons, jails, psychiatric facilities at the center of our conversations around criminalization, specifically of Black life. My name is Reina Gossett, and one of the things that I do is work at the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, which is an organization that seeks to raise the political voice and leadership of low-income and/or people of color who are transgender, gender nonconforming, and intersex. We believe that the incarceration of trans and gender nonconforming people is an urgent and complex matter, and because state violence, such as the prison industrial complex, we understand it as a gendering apparatus, meaning the prisons, police, and jails, the carceral systems, produce gender in a coercive way that has almost nothing to do with how people understand themselves. And in order to understand the carceral system, we believe it's really important to look at trans and gender nonconforming, particularly Black trans women navigating the prison industrial complex, to both understand the reach of the prison industrial complex in the carceral system, but also some of the most important abolitionist moments and movements to dismantle it, to grow alternatives, and to change conditions for people on the inside. And when I say abolition, I'm speaking as a person who believes that prisons, police, and jail are never going to be solutions to harm, that people are actually practicing ways that don't rely on state violence, the police, the prisons, and jails, to intervene on harm, to prevent it, to ultimately repair it, and to transform relationships. One of the ways that we're seeing the criminalization of our lives happen and is the police of our survival, the everyday policing of our survival. Here in New York State, one of the most urgent and complex matters is our access to healthcare. There's a lot of myths right now going on about what trans healthcare is, or healthcare for trans and gender nonconforming people. So I think I'm just going to do like a really quick 101 about what trans healthcare means. So trans healthcare is something that isn't just one form of treatment. There's no just the one surgery. It's something that's personal to each and every person who's trans or gender nonconforming. It's something that's medically necessary. And here in New York State, because of ways that trans and gender nonconforming people are locked out of formal economies, we're often reliant on public benefits in order to survive, especially at a time when unemployment in our community is at an all-time high. In New York State, access to public benefits include Medicaid, which is public health care. And since 1995, New York State's Medicaid has had a regulation that specifically denies trans and gender nonconforming people access to health care. The same treatments that non-trans or cis people are afforded, for instance, estrogen, if a cis woman is going through menopause, is covered under Medicaid. That same treatment is specifically denied to trans women. So like a trans woman would be denied estrogen for hormone replacement therapy. When that happens, it's not more expensive, it's actually really affordable. Studies have shown when we don't have access to healthcare that we need, like other people, our mental health goes down, our suicidality goes up, and because we're deeply invested in our own survival, we find other ways to get what we need. And often that means entering into criminalized economies. So I'm talking specifically about sex work, but not just that. And the ways that if our survival, and specifically access to healthcare and also access to work, is incredibly criminalized, that's when we think it's really important to understand the prison industrial complex as a gendering apparatus. Meaning, if we're talking about stop and search in New York City, how that plays out for Black trans women is actually stop and strip search, right? It's actually which is something that, in conversations about abolishing and talking about the carceral system, that's never talked about, right? Police, NYPD officers right here in New York stopping people and strip searching them in full view of other people. That's a form of violence that's so often not included in general conversations about criminalization. That's a form of violence that's specifically targeting Black women. That's a form of violence that Black women who are trans are so often kept out of the conversation about, and it's not just stop and strip search, it's also, in New York City, up until recently, condoms, and they still are used as evidence here in New York, as evidence of people engaged in sex work. And so I think one of the things that's really important to remind ourselves, if we're seeing that some of the ways that criminalization are happening are through transphobia, are through anti-Black racism linked to transphobia, that we're not going to figure out the ways to undo that, to dismantle the prison industrial complex, unless we center in our conversations people who are at the highest rates of criminalization. And I'm specifically talking about trans women of color, people who are historically excluded from conversations about criminalization in the first place. One of the other things that we're, when it comes to healthcare, that we're navigating and we're trying to really push really hard as at the center of understanding criminalization is that not just there are women in men's prisons, because there are people, trans women are currently locked up in men's prisons. You're incarcerated in New York State just like other states based on not how you understand yourself or how you identify or even what your paperwork says, but based on your genital status. And that's a really important way to understand how the prison industrial complex, how policing reproduces itself. Right now in New York State, trans women who want to have some kind of level of safety inside a prison are placed by their genital status and either are navigating 23 hours of solitary confinement, which is called quote-unquote protective custody, or they're said if you have one specific kind of procedure, which is sexual reassignment surgery or gender reconfinement surgery, which changes your genitals and is one of the only procedures that's a sterilization procedure, you can be placed in a woman's prison. As Cece McDonald, who is a black trans woman who was recently released after defending her life in Minnesota, talked about, there's no such thing as a safe prison, right? Like, let's end that idea that there's there's anything that will ever be a safe prison. But it's also really important to support the people who are currently navigating criminalization, who are the most vulnerable to state violence. And when the only procedure that is the one that's going to afford people some level of safety is a sterilization procedure, and one that most people who are trans and gender nonconforming don't want or can't afford, and certainly not covered under public benefits, like Medicaid, even though it used to be. I think the conversation about eugenics and the policing of black life amongst the people who are most vulnerable to criminalization needs to be at its core. I'm just going to check my time. One of the other things that I think is really important, and I always try to bring into the room when we talk about trans and gender nonconforming people navigating criminalization and state violence, is that there's a narrative that happens where we're seen and written about and talked about only as victims, right? And not as people who are deeply invested in self-determination struggles, right? Meaning that the people most affected, those of us who are most vulnerable to criminalization and violence, are actually powerful and capable of transforming the world and these systems and should be at the center of these struggles. And we're actually producing the theories about how to dismantle these systems. So I think it's really important to just add the level of we're not just victims, we're not just people who are killed and put into carceral carceral systems, we're also actively invested in figuring out how to dismantle them brick by brick. And that's why it's so important also to center the political voice and visibility of black trans women engaged in these conversations and navigating criminalization every day. I'm gonna stop there and turn it over to Jen.
We'll now hear from Janet Jakobsen.
Thank you, Kendall, and thanks to the organizers of this conference. I'm both honored and humbled to have been invited to be part of this conversation, and I'm just so grateful to them for making such a rich conversation. Particularly humbled because much of what I know about the topic that we're discussing this morning I've learned from people on this panel, and especially Reina Gossett, whose project No One Is Disposable with CC McDonald can be found on the Barnard Center for Research on Women website and will be continuing on, so I encourage you to check it out. Reina said I could say that. I study religion, and so I started with the question of the conference, are the gods afraid of black sexuality? And I have to say that the gods that I study, which are, they preside over what historian Alan Lichtman has called white Protestant nation, are afraid of black sexuality. And I want to be clear about my relationship to these particular gods. They are not the ones to whom I pray, but they are the ones that I study, and I spend a lot of time with them. They're scary. And, you know, but I hope that that means that maybe other people won't have to as much. And Lichtman, who's a historian of American nationalism, obviously, just to give you a sense of the connection between specifically this fear of black sexuality and of the need to, the imperative to police black bodies. I want to just give a couple of examples as I go through this. One is a quote from Barry Goldwater's 1964 presidential campaign, which you could argue is the beginning of a political movement that continues to be powerful in the United States today. Lichtman quotes from a campaign memo that says, quote, "The campaign should use carefully coded language to tap into white fear of black crime and sexuality without directly stirring racial antagonism." So what I'm concerned about is the ways in which this connection between crime and sexuality, first of all, makes black sexuality itself a crime. And conversely, there's also a sense that black sexuality is in need of policing because it also fuels, this sense that black sexuality is in need of policing also fuels other forms of policing black bodies that continue today, both on the streets of Ferguson, Missouri, and in all 5 boroughs of New York City. Lichtman quotes Goldwater as making this converse connection between sexuality and crime just as directly as the connection that makes black sexuality always already criminal. Quote, "On the campaign trail, Goldwater charged the following. Quote, "The moral fiber of the American people is beset by rot and decay. It is on our streets that we see the final terrible proof of a sickness that not all the social theories of 1,000 social experiments have even begun to touch. Crime grows faster than population, while those who break the law are accorded more consideration than those who try to enforce the law." And I think we've seen in recent months in the United States that that's simply not true. The reason that I wanted to raise the ways in which white Protestant nationalism fuels the policing of black bodies and black sexuality, I think this is a fairly obvious point for many of the people in the audience for this particular conference. But at the same time, I am concerned about the ways in which we study religion in particular, and the ways in which we understand the relationship between religion and nationalism. So that, for example, one of the ways in which we have come to understand this relation is through what Robert Bellah calls the civil religion of the United States. And Bellah shows this by following what presidents say in their inaugural addresses and the ways in which they invoke religion in their inaugural addresses. And, you know, he presents it as a somewhat benign set of religious interests that provide a sort of Durkheimian sense that you're holding the nation together. But my question is this: what does it mean when a legal scholar like Michael Madison calls the values of civil religion, quote, "values that are essential to American democracy," and yet those values are the values of white Protestant nationalism? Those values are the values that demand the policing of black bodies. What does it mean when the understanding in the field of religious studies about what unifies the nation is precisely one that demands the kind of criminalization that my colleagues here have already talked about today? And the final point I want to make is that this runs across political spectrum, and I would like to say across religious spectrums. Of course it doesn't, because all the presidents except John Kennedy have been Protestant in some form. So it is, but whatever your brand of Protestantism in terms of the way that presidents present themselves, and certainly whatever the political affiliation of the president and of US politics, this need to police black bodies is part of the program. I just want to offer one other example, which is Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton is many things, but he's not a Goldwater Republican, at least I think not. But he also, as you know, was a proponent of the 1996 Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act, which is also known as welfare reform. And this bill was primarily focused on economic policy, and I think we sometimes miss that. It changed the Social Security Act provision of Title 4A, which was established in 1935. It's rarely talked about in terms of economics. It's mostly talked about in terms of sexuality and teenage motherhood. And I, with the students at the Barnard Center for Research on Women, coded the entire congressional debate about this. Pink was sex, green was economics. Pink showed up all the time. Green, every once in a while someone mentioned that this was an economic policy that we were talking about in the nation. Black sexuality, the idea of this coded message that Goldwater was talking about, was absolutely central to this debate. And in fact, Bill Bradley even named it as such. He literally said, this is a coded debate that we're having right here. And yet, it continued on as if this was a way to talk about changing the structure of the welfare state itself. So that when we think about how the state works in relation to economic policy, much less in relation to economic justice, what's at the heart of it is precisely the type of policing that we've talked about so far today in terms of criminalization. So my concern is that it's not just a matter of the Christian right, it's not just a matter of conservative politics, it is central to and embodied in the way that nationalism in the United States works, that the gods must be afraid of black sexuality. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Mignon Moore.
Hello. Glad to be back in New York and on my way to Barnard in January to join the faculty there. It's good to be home. I think I've had about a 26-year relationship now with Columbia University in its different forms, starting from when I came as an undergraduate in 1988, I'll tell you that. Anyway, okay, so in my first book, Invisible Families, Gay Identities, Relationships, and Motherhood Among Black Women, I argued that the move from private to public expressions of sexuality are taking place in national and international arenas, but are also profoundly affecting life in the local public and private spaces of church pulpits and barbershops and coffee shops and around the dinner table and those types of places across the country. In Yoruba Richen's fabulous film, The New Black, LGBT Rights and African American Communities, beautifully captures the nuances and how these discussions are playing out in black spaces. And it's actually being screened here this afternoon as part of the conference. In my own research, I analyzed some of the tactics that black LGBT people use when negotiating multiple identity statuses that are based in race, gender, and sexuality to create a sense of belonging in black environments. And as the folks in this room know, black neighborhoods have always been central locations for gay African American social life. But prior to the 1980s, gay sexuality in racial minority communities was rarely articulated openly in public settings. It was not recognized as part of the larger community narrative of discrimination and struggle, and gay blacks tended not to openly create families together. Data from the census show that the majority of black same-sex couples continue to reside in cities, towns, and rural areas that are predominantly African American. So of the top 10 metropolitan areas with the highest proportion of black same-sex households, all 10 were in the South. And they're more likely to live with other blacks than in white gay enclaves. Now, historians define a modern gay identity as one whose subject incorporates homosexual behavior into everyday experiences and encourages others to acknowledge this sexuality. Well, I'm going to briefly talk today about some of the realities of African American lesbians and gay men as they try to take on a quote-unquote modern gay identity in predominantly black environments. And I'm going to focus my comments on blacks in the southern U.S., the particularities of the South, of Southern culture, and of black Southern culture are an important context in which to understand their experiences. I'm going to show how social class and regional environment work together, social class and regional environment, to shape vastly different experiences of middle and upper class blacks and of working class and poor folk who are LGBT. I'm going to do this in the context of black religious spaces and specifically black church cultures. So for the purposes of this talk, I'm focusing on lesbians and gay men, but the larger project also includes bisexuals and transgender folk. So to give you a bit of background, from 2000 to 2010, the number of same-sex couple households in the US increased by about 80%. from about 358,000 to about almost 650,000. 19% of these same-sex couples, about 125,000 couples, were raising almost 200,000 children under age 18. And that includes biological children, adopted children, stepchildren, but also grandchildren, children of relatives, that sort of thing. Now, same-sex couple parenting is actually more common in the South, in the Mountain West, and in the Midwest regions of the country, and those are the areas that have been the slowest to change in terms of the rights of LGBT people as parents and couples. While same-sex couples more generally tend to have higher educational attainment and earnings, couples with children tend to be more working class, they're more likely to be Black and Latina. So 41% of Black same-sex couples are raising children, compared to about 30% of Latino and Latina couples, 26% of American Indian and Alaskan Native couples, 17% of Asian and Pacific Islander, and 16% of white couples. Relative to whites, Black same-sex couples have higher rates of unemployment, they have lower rates of home ownership, lower annual earnings, and less education. And couples with children are more likely to be poor than our heterosexual married couple families. They're also more likely to receive government cash supports that are intended for low-income couples, and even single lesbian and gay and bisexual adults who are raising children are 3 times more likely than comparable non-LGBT people to be living at or near poverty level. Lesbian and gay couples who live in rural areas are much more likely to be low income than those in urban areas. So the level of legal protection that is accorded same-sex couple families varies in fundamental ways, depending on where they live, socioeconomic status, and race and ethnicity. Working in low-income same-sex couple families are less able to hire lawyers, to arrange alternative legal documents and contracts, or to pursue second partner adoption when their mates birth a child. But even with the legal recognition of marriage making its way through Dixie, states now like North Carolina and Virginia, I'm interested in how our people are getting along in their neighborhoods and churches. You know, how are things at the family reunion? How are things at Sunday dinner at grandma's house? So I started this small book project, and I'm thinking it's going to be less of an academic work and more geared toward a more general audience. It examines how LGBT people who have a primary identity in race, ethnicity, or a particular culture or religion that condemns homosexuality, how they manage these conflicting identity groups. And so I've recruited, or I'm in the process of recruiting, Orthodox Jewish people, Muslims, conservative Greek Americans. There's an Armenian woman in my study. But I'm starting with the interviews with Black lesbians and gay men and transgender people who come from a conservative Christian faith. So I'm offering you today Raheem Banks, that's a pseudonym. Raheem lives in Atlanta, Georgia with his husband and their 2 adopted children. He was raised in an apostolic Pentecostal church. Raheem has a graduate degree and he works for a biotech company. His husband, Glenn, is a pastor of a church that keeps traditional Pentecostal beliefs, but they're still welcoming to everyone, including LGBT people. And they're in Atlanta, as I said. They live in a grand house, a beautiful, beautiful house. And together they have a 6-figure income. And when I say 6-figure, I'm not talking about one that starts with a 1 or a 2. So they got a lot of money, especially for Atlanta, you know. So Raheem's mother-in-law lives with them and watches the babies. They also have a nanny and a housekeeper. And when I asked Raheem to tell me about how he and his family were getting along in Atlanta, a southern city and a state that's conservative when it comes to gay rights, he surprised me by saying that he is only, maybe you say I shouldn't have been surprised, but he says he's only experienced an enormous amount of love and support, even from those who, quote, might not support the community. And as I listened to him speak, there were several factors that contributed to his success in navigating the South as an openly gay Black man with a husband, raising 2 Black children, and actively participating and leading the church. One is, of course, economic resources. So when he was telling me about his path to fatherhood, he spoke of a network of people who helped to make it happen. They adopted their 2 children, and the attorney that they hired to shepherd them through the legal system knew who all the gay and gay-friendly judges were and made sure that, you know, they were seated in front of one of them. The whole procedure went smoothly without a hiccup. Second, several times he mentioned that Atlanta is a Black gay destination city, or gay destination city, which makes his life much easier. And the census supports this contention. Atlanta is one of the top 5 large metropolitan areas for Black gays, Black same-sex couples. And as such, the mainstream Black churches have lots of gay members and large numbers of Black LGBT people in the congregation, which gives them greater exposure. And Raheem says it helps to quote-unquote normalize gay and lesbian folks. So these numbers in the city at large, in all the public spaces and such, help to silence those who theologically might not agree with it. Third, he goes on to say that he's a leader in an affirming church, church. And yesterday, some of the panel speakers, even this morning, the dean touched on the presence of churches and religious centers that draw on some traditional forms of Black worship while also being inclusive and welcoming to LGBT folks. Raheem's church is like this. It keeps traditional Pentecostal beliefs, but he also has a pastor and a first gentleman of the church. Fourth, his life is a model of respectability, and we've been talking a lot about that at this conference. Raheem said that when he walked around with his daughter and a baby carrier in his chest, even when he was with his husband and people could see that they were a family, Black people responded affirmatively, saying to him that rarely have they seen Black men so actively involved in raising their young children. And they say that's not the norm in their experience with men. So here it's interesting because the comparison group for the community has not been a heterosexual couple, right? Are the children worse off being raised by gay men instead of a married man and woman, but absent Black fathers. And look at these men. They're very present and involved in their children's lives. And isn't that a good thing? And they appear very well off. Isn't that good for the children as well? So this is one area, and there are many, where the racial context and the community's experience around Black men and families sets up a dynamic that may not have been considered in debates and discussions about gay men raising children. And a fifth factor that has helped Raheem is what his money has been able to buy. He says that in some of the smaller churches outside of Atlanta, he's aware of the rejection, the homophobia in the pulpit, of people being kicked out of their churches. But these things are not showing up in his life because of the way it has been constructed. And he admits to being able to create a bubble of acceptance for himself and his family. So I asked how those outside of the gay destination cities in places like Greensboro or Spartanburg, how are they faring? Okay, Kendall says I have 1 minute, but I have 3 more minutes of talking. Okay, so he says I can take some of his.
Okay then.
Thank you. Okay, so, but I do want to finish. So here's where the version of don't ask, don't tell is still in full effect. There's this Southern decorum, knowing smiles, everyone knows, but nobody talks about it. He talks about how gays and lesbians are good for the neighborhood and community. People like to have them in their neighborhood. They keep their homes clean and that sort of thing. But I ask, what happens in the spiritual spaces? Well, it turns out that the people's evolution is connected to the economic success of the lesbians and gay men that they see. So some of their theology says, if you're doing well, then God must be pleased with you. And he said he's even seen this with his mother-in-law, who was not very, not so accepting, but they're doing so well, so they must be all right in God's eyes. But the less advantaged cannot afford this kind of grace, which I thought was a profound thing to say. They cannot afford this grace. Their theology connects God's favor to how well you're doing. So it's this prosperity-based theology where how you're living economically is an indication of how well you're living, right? How well you're living is about how well you're living spiritually. Now, I also spoke with Reverend Onitha Montgomery, it's a pseudonym, a Black lesbian minister in Memphis, Tennessee. She was ordained in the Full Gospel Baptist Church. I met her back in 2009 when I gave a talk at the University of Memphis, and back then she said they were really struggling in terms of religion and Black sexuality. But when I interviewed her for this project, she said a great deal had changed. She pointed to several African-American gay-affirming churches that are now in Memphis. One is one of these vision churches that Raheem is a part of in Atlanta. And she listed 3 different churches that were gay-affirming, that were black gay-affirming, but in 2009 she said it was only the white gay-affirming churches that would say, okay, come on blacks, you can come on with us. She has a prison ministry, and part of her current work, she lives in a low-resource neighborhood where people are struggling. And she also said that more education, but also having more experience in the world gives gays and lesbians in the South more protection from harassment. So instead of being vilified, they're seen as more interesting and more chic. Some of the struggles that she says remain in the South are clarity about the belovedness of the single person in the church, which I thought was really interesting. She's married, but she finds that in the church, they're not truthful when they say they're family-oriented because they're not inclusive. People are made to feel that something's not right with them if they don't have a mate. And when I asked about the couples in the census, that I was thinking of the low-income black families with children, how they were faring in the church, and she said, this stuff about acceptance is not even on their radar. They are not interested in what the people in the church have to say about them. They are not trying to get accepted. They are sharing their food stamps with each other and keeping it moving. So she said they didn't fall into the trap that more traditional non-affirming churches set for self-rejection. They just don't even accept it. But she also admits that at times she has retreated to this don't ask, don't tell way of getting along. And she recounts a recent experience when she went to visit this church. It was a much older congregation in what she calls a raw, impoverished area of South Memphis, a place with low literacy. And when the pastor of the church introduced her wife, Reverend Montgomery's wife, to the congregation, he introduced her as his sister. And she did not correct him. And she told me, quote, if my being a lesbian is going to stop you from meeting Jesus, I might not bring it up. And in that moment, she wanted to minister to them, and she says, quote, her relationship with them was more important in that moment than her being a lesbian. So I'm out of time, but I just wanted to give you a sampling of some of the issues that folks in the South are grappling with around the relationships that they have with the church as a representation of black culture and black respectability. The struggle is real, it's more present for some than others, and it's multifaceted. And so I welcome your questions and comments as I continue in this line of work. Thank you.
Our commentator for the panel is Jafari Allen.
Let me, like everyone else, thank Yosef and thank Laura and Jennifer and Sean and Sharon for creating this space, opening this space, and for inviting me here. Thank you very much. I'm, like everyone else on this panel, really excited and humbled and want to hear more. So I'm going to speak very briefly because I want to have more of this conversation. And I'm going to take as my text this morning. See, I learned something. Thank you. I'll bring the mic closer to me. I was thinking yesterday that I've always been interested in this notion of the black church, because the church that I grew up in was all black, but it was a Presbyterian church. And my mother's version of getting happy and being filled with the Spirit looked like this. And so my experience is a bit different from other people's experiences here. And I count that experience of growing up in a church where process was the most important thing. The motto of the Presbyterian Church is everything in decency and in order. The motto says nothing about Jesus. It is about order, and that was very important in my upbringing, and my learning how to be in meetings, and learning how to be in groups, and learning how to be an organizer later in my life. And I'm grateful for that, even though there are people at my home church who still expect me to one day come back to that pulpit, and they can wait. They can wait. My calling happens to be here. But the text for this morning is taken from Mignon Moore's Responded, this notion of cannot afford grace. cannot afford grace, that it seems to me that all of these papers bring up this notion of those among us who cannot afford grace, those who we do not afford, to whom we do not afford grace, where else grace may be this spiritual facility, but it is also something that we give to one another, and that in a body politic that we also have to advocate for one another. So the charge of this panel is to ask how black bodies are policed by a variety of disciplining regimes, and this goes really nicely in tandem with the questions yesterday about whose gods, what gods, to where we, and to whom are we referring when we say this. But it also brings up the critical perennial Stuart Hall question: what sort of moment is this in which to pose these questions? And so some of that came up yesterday when Yosef talked about the beginning of cars, and other people talked about the debates around Proposition 8 and these notions of religious people, of black people spoiling our progression from the dark ages of homophobia to the glaring, wonderful HRC skies of freedom. And one of the most important and really gratifying things about this conference from the first moment is this really principled and thoroughgoing critique of this notion that as black folks, that's messing it up for everybody. And complicating the notion that that those of us who at least said, no, it's not just the black folks, it's them religious black folks that are messing up for everyone, that this complicates these notions. And the panel today, I think, brings us full circle to how we need to reconceive what Kathy Cohen has called a new agenda for black politics. What we see on this panel is a new agenda for black politics. It was first, I think, for me, underscored yesterday in Dion Hayward's conversation when we first began to talk about respectability in terms of everyday politics in New Orleans. The very notion of church people not wanting to see that on their way to church so much that they would be on the wrong side, what many of us would think is the wrong side of these arguments about care and about grace. And so my questions for these panelists today are, I hope that we can talk about the strategies that people are actually using, that is the strategies that incarcerated people and people who are formerly incarcerated are using, and people who are living with HIV and AIDS are using to disrupt these narratives, and not only disrupt these narratives, but to advocate for different policies and different ways of living. How transgender and Reina began to talk about some of that. In fact, Reina's work is in the Sylvia Rivera Law Project is specifically about this. So to talk more about the ways that this, what I'm understanding as very clear black radical politics, very clear black feminist politics of thinking about who at the intersection is the most vulnerable, and building our politics from there and building our policies from there. How is there a rapprochement between the work that's happening among black trans folks and, for example, black civil rights, black churches, black academics, so that our conversation broadens, and that it doesn't always have to be someone from the Sylvia Rivera Project, right? Or someone who was formerly incarcerated, or someone who was suffering this lack of grace to bring up these issues. That these are issues that are at the center of our agenda and the center of our politics at all times, so that one doesn't have to be in the room to do that. And I go back again to Dion Haywood, because one of the things that was so striking to me yesterday is when she said the bar is set for black girls. Do you remember that notion? And she said the bar is set, and she did this in terms of, and we think of the bar as something that one has to reach, or a standard, but the bar is also, as we've seen on this panel, they are bars, they are physical, and the bars are set for so many of our children. The bars are ready. The carceral, that Reina didn't talked about the carceral, but to broaden that more, to think about what Reina means about the carceral not just being those bars upstate, but for example, the school to prison pipeline, the ways in which we would think for our children. One of the ways that we have set to have our children have good educational experiences in good charter schools and good religious schools is to have them wear ties or skirts and walk in a line to class in silence. What are we preparing people for? What are we preparing our children for? I won't go into, but if you'd like to talk about it, my alma mater and Morehouse College and our recent discussions about the appropriate dress policy and the controversy there, and my transformation from a really flip disregard for what I thought was a silly black middle class anxiety that I also suffered under at that institution and elsewhere. But coming to understand that anxiety is real, that people really do believe that if you wear a suit and if you don't have your pants dragging, that you'll be protected. People really do believe this. Some people in this room really do believe this. This came up yesterday also, that if one comports oneself as a proper middle class subject, that there will be protection. And then alas, Mignon comes with what as social scientists we see is data that suggests that there is something that kind of looks like it might be a protection from some sort of insults, but not all, right? That is that one of the things that this new agenda for black politics has to consider is the increase in the distance between black folks who have and black folks who do not. So that some of what folks brought up yesterday about our nostalgia for yesteryear and for yesteryear and the way things used to be. One of those aspects is that before segregation, whether you were, we talked about skin color also, even if you happened to be upper class and high tone, you still had to live with the rest of us. And you got to lord over the rest of us, but you had to be there in those neighborhoods, right? Today, y'all don't have to. And I say y'all with tongue in cheek, because I don't have to. I get a check every month. Not like Mignon's respondents, right? But one in any case. And so this notion again of cannot afford grace brings us back to this. And I'm persuaded by Emily's entreaty for the rest of us to think about, those of us who are spiritual or religious people who don't do that in public, to think about one of the things that the ineffable, the ethical, that which drives us from the inside can drive us to do. One of the ways I would suggest to Emily and to us that we can bring into our work is to think about the ethics of those who cannot afford grace. And what we do then, if there are people around us, people who we study, people in our families who cannot afford grace, how do we increase grace? And so I said that I would be brief, and I am going to be brief, but I also just want to, I'm going to be very brief, I'm going to be quite brief, and just point to, and I had this whole thing about Janet Jakobsen's piece here, but I just want to point to what Miguel Gomez calls the 9 lives of the culture of poverty thesis. that this notion that there is something pathological about your culture is not something that just, and some young people, some of my students think that this just happened and that they're railing against respectability, which is wonderful, is new. It is not new, yet it has to keep happening because this pops up again and again and again. And what I wanted to say here about Jakobsen's work, like looking at those gods, is to pay particular attention to the ways that our first two black presidents were completely complicit in this, right? That Clinton, who was called this not as a compliment, but as a way to talk about the way that Clinton had been demonized in the Whitewater scandal and the Monica Lewinsky issue, as someone who was oversexed, someone who was, after all, from Arkansas and has a single mother and was playing the saxophone. That's what Toni Morrison meant when she said first black president. But the ways in which we allowed both of these black presidents to run roughshod over the least of these. So happy that we had Barack Obama in the White House that we allow him to go to black groups in the US and in Africa and say the same thing: pull up your pants. That is his entire policy: pull up your pants. How are we complicit in this stinginess around grace?
So I'm sure you will agree with me that we've just heard a series of excellent presentations. Bob Fullilove has given us a powerful analysis of the circulation of black bodies at the nexus of homophobia, HIV, religion, and mass incarceration, and directed our attention to the ways in which this confluence of racial moralism and religious moralism has hampered an effective response in our communities to HIV. Reina Gossett has revealed the workings of the carceral society and the prison industrial complex as a gendering and gender disciplining institution, which has had a profound and terrifying effect, specifically with regard to the policing of trans and gender non-conforming bodies at the threshold of life, death, and survival. Janet Jakobsen, in her discussion of white Protestant nationalism, has continued the theme that Bob Fullilove introduced about the disciplinary technology that is white Protestant religion and white Protestant nationalism at the boundaries of race, sex, and sexualities. Mignon Moore gave us a marvelous and nuanced integrated analysis of social class, region, and religious culture and the making of modern black and gay lesbian identities in this paradoxical and indeed maddening moment that one might call the age of Obama, which for me is the age of racial neoliberalism. And finally, Jafari Allen characteristically offered us a creative and critical synthesis of a new agenda, to clear the ground for talking about a new agenda that might help us think about ways forward. So I'm sure that there are many questions in the audience, and our protocol is going to be the following. We're going to ask each of you to come up to the mic. We're going to ask you to ask a question rather than offer us another presentation. We've had those. And we're going to take your questions in groups of two because it's 11:32 and I've been instructed that we need to wrap up by noon. So we'll continue the conversation, I'm sure, over lunch, but we'll begin that conversation now with our sister who's at the mic.
Yep, thank you. And thank you for the panel and certainly the one earlier. And I was going to ask this question at that panel, which is to say it's a question that basically exceeds any number of panels. And that is to talk about the term, the politics of respectability, which is a term that we're employing as a trope, as a cliche, And I was reminded that this is actually a term that had a certain kind of historic specificity in the way that Higginbotham used it originally. Obviously, it no longer has that. So my question is, in the way yesterday that we talked about what is the usefulness of homophobia in the Black church or in Black churches, what is the usefulness to us as scholars in the continued use of the term the politics of respectability, as if we throw it forward as an answer to everything, but we're not offering a counter critique or something that replaces it? So I think when you start to use a trope or a cliche as loosely as that, it's rendered meaningless in a place where we're actually trying to think in different and new ways about the questions of the relationship between religion and sexuality. So that's my mega comment question.
Great. We'll take another question and then
All right,
responses.
This question is for Dr. Fullilove. How does one go about integrating both the positive and negatives of religion and spirituality in public health and HIV prevention? Thank you.
That was a small question, but one I'm sure you're up to answering. So, panelists, politics of respectability, the limits of its utility as an analytic and explanatory category, and positive and negative aspects of religion as a tool in HIV prevention and treatment work, or public health more broadly. Thoughts?
Well, I'll say I think there's more that we can do with this idea of respectability and what it means in Black communities for Black folks. I think that, I guess you would suspect what I would say. I think these class divisions are magnified but with an excuse of respectability. I think that it is true what Jafari said, that we have this false hope of being spared, our lives being spared, if we can, look a certain way and behave a certain way. I think it can serve you well in a temporary sense, but the larger structures of racial inequality will prevail, and I think sometimes we forget that. But I also look to Kathy Cohen's Theories of Marginalization in her Boundaries of Blackness book as a way to understand why the Black middle and upper middle class fall so heavily on this safety net of respectability. So it's not quite an answer to Barbara's comment, but I do think that with each generation, there are different ways to consider how respectability is functioning, and the different political climates that we face call for us to interrogate it in important ways.
Anybody else on that specific question, Jafari?
Yes, thank you. I have to say that that's an interesting challenge, because as I'm thinking that in my research in my first book on Cuba, I don't use the term respectability in that way. I talk about nationalism, I talk about masculinity, but it seems almost that it's really apt, because when I think of respectability, I of course think of club women, and I think of the ways in which their good work was very much like the work that I see happening on college, on HBCU campuses. That is that there's a project, an investment in not only being respectable for respectability's sake, or having an image for an image's sake, but really being invested in what that does. And it does have some purchase. And I think we ought to be honest about the purchase that it has, but at the same time, the real danger of falling on what it purchased maybe 40 years ago, and what it can today. And I'm also thinking of the new work by my colleague Vesla Weaver, who is looking at data sets and opinions that show that even though middle-class Black people still believe that they are connected to Black communities, and politics haven't changed that much even as they get more money. The inverse is also to that as people get poorer, they see a tremendous gulf between middle-class Blacks and themselves, to the point where they believe that middle-class Black people don't care anything about them. And so I think that we have to keep our eye on this. And the thing that happened, the piece that Kathy moved to after Boundaries of Blackness is this notion of deviance as resistance, and the ways in which we can look at people intentionally knowing, I know that you want me to talk like this, and so I'm going to talk like this specifically to show you, or non-intentional deviance, and the ways that we need to look very carefully at that to see what the political utility of that can be, and the ways that people are actually using that on the ground.
Any other panelists on this question of respectability? It bears remarking that the idea still has some traction. Randall Kennedy, in his book on race, law, and crime, argues affirmatively for the cultivation among Black communities of our racial reputation, and the demonstration that we can embody and achieve lives that are consistent with white middle-class standards. So, and we can contrast the politics of respectability with the politics of respect, at whose center may be defiance, deviance, abjection, and the like. On this question of public health, religion, good and bad aspects.
What I was trying to invoke in my talk was simply this. In 1964, much of what I was doing in Mississippi with colleagues was using the church and the spirituality of the Black community as a way of telling people it's time for us to vote. It's time for us to organize. It's time for us to move against the forces of oppression. It was the most powerful message we had, asking people to consider what was happening in the movement as part of their spiritual lives was, I think, what animated so much of the movement's successes back in those days. Fast forward to 2014, the whole notion that we're able to engage in HIV not just as a struggle of the individual living with the virus, but as a community challenge that affects us all, means that you cannot have these conversations without invoking that sense of spirituality that is so present in the community and the institutions that we've put there to help us understand how spirituality affects our individual lives. I don't know how to have the conversation without inviting the clergy in to say, what do we do as a people and as a community to do something that is clearly impacting us in ways that cannot even begin to be described 30 years into this epidemic. That homophobia is alive and well in the African American church has to be countered, I think, by the fact that some of the most vigorous leaders in the struggle against HIV are Black clergy. So on the one hand, we're part of the problem, but God help us, we are also part of the solution.
Great. We'll take two more questions, please.
My name is Armanthea Duncan. I'm a doctoral student at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And recently, I presented research at the 99th ASALA conference. And the moderator asked me a question that I had a very strong reaction to, and it has a lot to do with where I'm located. But the question was, is American consciousness violent, right? And that question continues to plague me, and listening to you all speak, before I present the question, I want to first say thank you, and this compliment is very apropos for this conference. Your presentations really bless my spirit. So given that, I take the stance that American consciousness is indeed violent towards Black and brown bodies, right? And as a teacher in a predominantly white institution, and my classrooms are typically filled with predominantly white students, right? I see that there's something going on the conscious level amongst these students. And for the type of work that needs to be done that you all are advocating for, I see that there needs to be a reimagination, right, of the realities in which many of us are living and dwelling in on a day-to-day basis. So given that, you know, these students, myself, and many of us in this room have been socially conditioned by what I would say are these salient, solidified structural institutions of power that have literally like suffocated and stifled, right, our independent modes of thought. So my question is, how important is it that the work that needs to be done to move us forward is couched in forcing society, forcing America to change and reimagine its consciousness?
Great, thank you so much. Yes, please.
Afternoon, thank you. I'll echo that, that gratitude for the blessing you offer us. This question is primarily for Reina, but I also wanted to thank you individually, Reina, for your call to conscience, but also for the work that you do that's vital in the way that Vitality works in order to preserve actual lives. And so I'm very grateful for you for preserving those lives. Thank you. This notion of the relationship of trans and gender nonconforming bodies, especially to African-based spiritual traditions, and how vital they are for spirit possession often. I wonder if you could speak to the relationship between experiencing this kind of criminality and the possibility of those traditions allowing for or helping through some kind of care practice, healing perhaps. I mean, in this kind of mashup of Hortense Spillers and Zora Neale Hurston, if black women, and this includes trans women, are the mules of the world, black trans women are also these divine horses at the same time. And if there is a way that people are using their spiritual practice to manage this criminality, to form community, especially here in New York, where you have voodooisants, condomblistas, you have santeros, people who are working through these spiritual practices and forming community. Do the trans folks feel part of, and gender nonconforming folks who are so central in those religions often feel like they're able to form community and do something both to contest what I imagine is also homophobia and transphobia in those spaces, but also claim a kind of vitality amongst them to deal with the criminal justice system. So, but thank you.
Great, so we have two questions, one about cultural and political imaginaries that might drive a wedge between American consciousness and its investment in and dependence on violence, and another question on the use of spirituality as a resource in trans communities for healing and restoration. Take it away.
I mean, I think you answered your question, which is yes, you know. Absolutely. I think about when a lot of what I was thinking about when I was, oppression doesn't just affect our material condition, right? It affects our relationships with our spiritual beliefs, with our relationships with other people, how we feel about ourselves. And so part of the resistance to forms of oppression, such as transphobia and the intersex of transphobia, sexism, and anti-black racism, are about reclaiming those relationships. That's certainly been the case for me, and I think some of the most exciting work comes out of that place. So I really appreciate you bringing that question up. It can't exist without it. And I look to the work of New York City's and Ohio's Trans Women of Color Coalition as leading those conversations around specifically re-engaging spirituality as a place in a site of resistance against transphobia and anti-black racism. And then I also was thinking about just like my theory of change in response to the first question about like politicization and consciousness raising. It's like definitely yes. I think about how it's so important when we're trying to prevent, intervene, repair, and transform the violences that we're navigating, to not just have a focus on our behaviors, right? Or even the structures and systems that hold those kinds of violent behaviors, but also in terms of shifting the consciousness and understanding where we are in this political moment. And for me, where I think we are for this political moment is the highest ever homicide rate for trans women of color happening is this year. And the second highest was last year. And thinking about, the question of transforming consciousness is so often tied into the question of visibility. And for me, really, saying that isn't actually visibility, isn't the same as politicization or political education or transforming consciousness. This was the year that Laverne Cox, Orange and the New Black, was on the cover of Time, was also the year of the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Projects documenting the highest ever homicide rate against trans women of color. And I think there's a really direct relationship between those. So that's what I think about when I think about transforming consciousness.
Janet, I'm going to ask you to address this question about the imagination. Stuart Hall once said that the way people imagine themselves is one of the central vectors of political life. And as Lyndon was speaking, and also as Mignon was speaking, I thought of 1994, 20 years ago this year, and a conference that Jackie Alexander and Kathy Cohen and Cheryl Clark and Robert Reed Farr and a bunch of us organized called Black Nations, Queer Nations. Mm-hmm. So it makes me want to ask, what are the uses and limits, if any? What are the uses and the limits of nationalisms, of national imaginaries as a way of contesting this consciousness that the sister referred to earlier, the national consciousness that seems to be organized around, in, and through the images and apparatuses and practices of violence and death that are so, if there is an American exceptionalism, that may be it, right?
Exactly.
What do you say about how we might go about reimagining a nationalism, or does nationalism, is nationalism an ideology or a way of understanding ourselves that we ought to think about abandoning?
Excellent question, and I want to thank you for your question too. It moved me. I was very touched by it, so I'm going to try to be coherent in response. And I wanted to say that Kendall crystallized what I was trying to say in my remarks, which is this: in terms of the politics of respectability, the idea that people might aspire to the standards of white middle classness, and to me those standards are tremendously violent. Mm-hmm. There's violence in white middle class homes, and that violence is connected to an entire system of violence. And our education system, the public school system in the United States, is part of that. So in addition to talking about the school to prison pipeline, we should be talking about some kind of school to oppressor pipeline, where part of what we're doing is training people to be in a system where, in order for them to feel safe, they feel like they have to do violence to somebody else. Because that's what class promises you. That if you do violence to somebody else, you will be safe. And that if you can blend that with whiteness, all the more so. And, I think a lot about the way that people become white in the United States. And that is a lot through class mobility, so as to wrap yourself in what you feel will be safety from that form of violence that you've experienced when you couldn't identify as white. So to me, that sense of we need to name the standards that are driving, when we think of my colleague Tracy West, who teaches at Drew, talks a lot about the way in which white people just presume that they're morally good, and that, and that we need to name that the moral standards of white middle classness in the United States are a problem, or bad even, evil, as an ethicist. And then to go to the question of nationalism, I think that we have to use all of these politics that are available to us. Any of the words that we use in social movements are double-edged, associated with different things. Justice in particular, which is associated in this country with the criminal justice system. So how do we think about that word? And I've learned a lot about the complexities of of thinking through nationalism through working with various movements of people who are marginalized from the possibility of being in a nation. So when I was very young, I worked for an organization called the Washington Office on Africa, and we did anti-apartheid work, and that was very much about making a new nation in South Africa and having a different vision of what was possible. And that was my political education. You know, I would travel with members of ANC who would tell me, you know, the United States does not have democracy. You know that, right? Of course I did not, but you know, and similarly around the study of indigeneity now, which is a lot about thinking about sovereignty and the ways in which it matters and how we can't simply erase it, and that the people who have been denied this know this in a different way than the people who, for whom it's been at the center of their lives. So I think that there are many different approaches, and you know, that moment, the mid-90s moment of Black Nation, Queer Nation, I think was one of the moments of hope and possibility that was opened up, and that as I have aged, have come to see that going back to those moments can be helpful. And I think that's some of what Emily was talking about this morning about that intergenerational conversation, which is there were moments when things got opened up and then closed down, and we maybe can reopen them by returning to some of those moments.
Great. We have time for one final question.
Thank you so much, panelists. I'm Carla Shedd, Assistant Professor of Sociology and African American Studies here at Columbia. And I study the carceral continuum, and I'm really interested in hearing from our activists in residence and perhaps one of the scholars about how we reconcile the relationship that Black and brown people in particular have with the state. Professor Moore said, I'm not here to talk about, you know, asking for marriage and this relationship with the state in this way. I'm here to talk about communities. But for those of us who get our basic provisions, housing, healthcare, hormones from the state, how do we think about going to them for help, but also being subject to violence from those same institutions, from those same authorities?
Professor Shedd, that's a great question. How do we engage the state even as we recognize the risks of that engagement?
Can I take a step?
Yeah, sure.
Let me just say, as somebody who has been teaching in 6 prisons in upstate New York, many of my students who are honest to God, real college students, represent for me the next cadre of folk who will be freedom fighters when they return. Their education, which is partially made possible by the state, it seems to me, is an exercise in training the next generation of folk who lead us in the struggle. There's something about coming to awareness on the inside and dedicating yourself to the study of how to make you and your life a tool for your people that I find to be very consistent with what we saw in South Africa, when so many of the current leaders of that nation were locked up and thinking about what would they do at the point that they were released. To the degree that the state makes it possible for education to occur on the inside, it is a way in which, in a neat way, they're also creating the possibilities for resistance. And as far as I'm concerned, the more the better.
Reina?
Sure. I mean, I think ditto to what you were saying. I think, for those of us who are navigating these questions, a lot of us just understand the state as, something that is only invested in disposability of Black life, of queer life, of transgender non-conforming life. And yet some of the most exciting campaigns and work that I'm engaged in or that I'm witnessing in this moment are around changing policies that help support our survival to dismantle the state. So I think about the, access to welfare, not even just increasing our benefits to welfare that I was involved in with Queers for Economic Justice maybe like 8 years ago, around like when transgender non-conforming people go to the welfare office here in New York, we're told, no, come back when you look like a man, no, come back when you look like a woman. Those are like access to benefits that we need in order to survive in this moment and to be part of social movements. And so I think that, just for me, my theory of change involves changing conditions or policies that support us resisting and dismantling the state, also dismantling the carceral system, and also growing alternatives. And I think that all three have to happen, and especially for people who's navigating incredible amounts of violence just accessing basic benefits to survive in this moment, whether it's hormones, like you mentioned, or other forms of healthcare, access to other forms of public benefits. Those campaigns and work to change policies so that we can be engaged in larger movements are critical.
Great. The combination of rigor and passion that this panel has given us is, it makes my soul happy. I'm sure that you will all join me in thanking the panelists for an excellent discussion. Thank you all so much.